Good morning. Today I'd like to talk to you about Navajo history to 1850, and I'll be drawing heavily on the work of. Before we see the Navajo appear in the written record, there is strong evidence, both genetic, linguistic, and archaeological, for groups of Athabascan-speaking hunter-gatherers that we'll collectively refer to as Apacheans, leaving the area near the U.S.-Canadian border and moving south, probably around 800 years ago, though possibly a century or so later. This was not a coordinated movement with any fixed destination. It wasn't like there was some sort of land rush on. Although, if you recall the timing for this was the time period when a great deal of space was abandoned by the Chacoans and ancestral Puebloan people. So given the amount of information exchange between indigenous communities, it is possible that there was an awareness of open lands. There was another thing that's possibly spurring this are increasingly cold winters in the Canadian Rockies and Plains that were brought upon by the Little Ice Age. The higher elevations of the southern slope of the Rocky Mountains, though, result in similar ecological zones being in this region compared to areas farther north than those found in western Arizona or the plains of Texas to the east and west of the Four Corners area. So if people are moving down that east slope of the Rockies, then they're going to encounter similar kinds of resources and temperatures and seasons there in the Four Corners region to areas further north in Colorado and even up into Wyoming. It's likely that the role of these people in the abandonment of the northern agricultural communities in the Southwest is debatable. While it's certainly probable that as they moved south, they would have run into the last few people hanging on to agricultural ways of life along the middle and upper Missouri, where they were particularly hard hit by the Little Ice Age, as well as the last survivors of the Fremont groups in the northernmost farming communities in Colorado and Utah. And they probably learned from and or absorbed them into their communities. There was certainly some amount of information transfer from these people into these Apachean migrants. By the time that the San Juan Basin and much of the Colorado Plateau was abandoned by the Chacoan people, these Athabascan groups must have quickly occupied the area. And the reason why we know this is that neither the Uto-Aztecan groups expanding outward from the Great Basin, from a point of origin in eastern California, beginning around 1,000 years ago and eventually reaching all the way into Colorado and northern Arizona, but they did not occupy the prime areas of the Four Corners area that had been abandoned by the ancestral Puebloans. Those were occupied by these Apachean groups. And so they either arrived right after the Chacoans left or they were there as those communities were being abandoned. So timing is very, very close. And so they were probably present at the very, very end of the Chacoan system. Neither did the human-speaking groups to the southwest, the Hohokam speaking groups, expand much towards the east during this time period. And they certainly had the technological know-how and irrigation techniques that they could have taken advantage of abandonment of these areas by ancestral Puebloans, but they did not. Certainly, it's also worth noting that the resurgence of the Puebloan communities during Pueblo IV times didn't manage to reoccupy these former core regions of their people either. So once these Apachean groups migrating from the north moved into the area very quickly following the collapse of Pueblo II, they were there to stay. Once we begin to see documents, when the Spanish arrived in New Mexico in the late 1500s, the Pueblos were almost entirely surrounded by Apachean peoples, with only the Hopi in the west having some non-Athapascan neighbors, and those were recent Uto-Aztecan arrivals. The Spanish decided to refer to these Athapascan-speaking people by the general name of Apache, then gave more particular names to the groups living in different areas of the region with somewhat different economies and lifeways. One of these groups, practicing more agriculture and having a more formal political structure and closer ceremonial ties to the Pueblos than other Apache groups, was called by the Spanish Apaches de Navajo. All of this likely similarity was due to greater cultural interaction and syncretism among these Navajo during their migration and with their more recent Pueblo neighbors. This was a particular group of these migrants who were either had more opportunity or were more willing to embrace new ideas, adopt new customs, incorporate people into their communities, perhaps, than some of their other recent migrant relatives. And this is really interesting to think about them in that sense. Here is the well-known Nicolas de Sanson map. You may remember this from our discussion of the concept of California. Here still shown as an island. But I want you, in this instance, to particularly pay attention to this right here. This is the location given by the Spanish there in Nuevo Mexico for the Apaches de Navajo. You can also see the Gila Apaches, Apaches Gila, Apaches Vaqueros, various other groups included there. So they're shown in 1656 as being somewhat north of some of these other groups. You can also see Zuni and Hopi there. So in this map, depending on how accurate you want to think it is, especially given that California is an island, the Navajo are shown as being towards the northeast of Zuni and Hopi, which would put them in the Colorado-New Mexico border region, somewhere in central northern part of New Mexico and south central Colorado. In the historic period, the Navajo are represented as a people who planted maize but moved widely for hunting and trading. They had extensive trading networks, especially with some of the Puebloan groups. And they were described as living in underground homes, which is actually a very good sort of gloss of the hogans, one shown here on the screen bottom left. But they're not actually the same thing as the semi-subterranean pit houses. It's a very different kind of structure in some ways. They had complex political relationships that could change as conditions altered. They were neither always friendly nor always hostile. They seemed to negotiate their own path, which is a tradition that has held true even till today. One thing that they were very consistent about is that they always bitterly opposed Spanish slavery and slave traders and catchers and all of that. And they also opposed those who participated in the buying and selling of people. Interestingly enough, despite being relatively recent arrivals, they closely allied with the Pueblos during the Revolt of 1680. And speaking of that, here you can see some representations of that revolt, sometimes known as the Revolt of Pope. Sculpture of him shown there. A pretty excellent book on the subject matter by David Roberts, shown there on the right. And I found this quite interesting, a sort of comic book cover version of this. There's not actually a comic that goes along with it. It's a work of art. But I thought that was quite clever. And if you're interested, there's a pretty good summary with only a few minor inaccuracies at this website shown at the bottom of the screen, which I've also posted to the Canvas site in the announcements. The Pueblo Revolt was a revolt against all the iniquities and oppressions of the Spanish colonial and missionary proselytizing system. It was something that, rather than being motivated by a unity of a political structure like you see in some other areas, this was one that was very much a grassroots origin. It was the discontent of the Pueblos with the Spanish and the unfairness and structural inequalities that were partly inherent to the casta system of racialized allocation of rights to people, as well as simply the situation of any colonial system where you have formerly independent people being oppressed under an occupying military force. There is no way around that being something that generates resentment and resistance. And it was successful. They drove the Spanish completely out of the northern parts of the Southwest. And they kept them out for 12 years until a combination of droughts and political fragmentation, because like I said, because it was grassroots, it had different communities participating for slightly different reasons. And then after the Spanish were gone, the unity of purpose of driving the Spanish out dissipated over time. And after 12 years, it was no longer a unified front, making it easier for the Spanish to return, which they did in 1692 with a vengeance. And being the Spanish, they did so with brutal ferocity, completely burning and destroying many pueblos, especially along the Rio Grande. Killing and enslaving everybody, men, women, and children, and generally speaking, behaving in what we have come to expect from the conquistador type stereotype, which was not the case in every instance or with every Spanish expedition, but this was one of those where they certainly earned that reputation. The Navajo aided the Puebloan people as a retreat for the many refugees from these Spanish punitive expeditions, especially the ones along the Rio Grande. And there was resistance. There was resistance at many places. But the force that the Spanish brought, in some ways to assuage their wounded pride, was nearly inexorable, and especially given the advantage in numbers and technology that the Spanish had, it was not feasible for a fragmented indigenous population to effectively resist. Had they maintained greater unity, they might have managed to resist for long. This pattern of destruction continued for 8 years and only really halted. The Spanish only really paused in this effort. They didn't flee the Southwest, but they only really paused in their further expansion of conquering and subjugating community after community, with the Hopi destruction of the town of Owadavie on Second Mesa in 1700. Gave the Spanish enough of a check that it paused the expansion for a while. In the canyons that were tributary to the San Juan River, the Navajo and Puebloan refugees first farmed and lived together, planning their resistance to the Spanish onslaught together, being the key that had been missing in the previous 8 years. Archaeological sites dating to this time period in the area, this is really an incredibly fascinating time period, include ceramics linking these people living in these canyons of the San Juan River to the pueblos of Tewa, Jemez, Zuni, and Carasan, as well as these Athapascan speakers that had arrived more recently. And Hopi refugees from that conflict at Owadavie also joined the Western Navajos in the Chinle drainage. And so at different portions of the territory occupied by these Navajo people, the Pueblo refugees joined them and incorporated and formed new communities in a really fascinating way, referred to today as the Dineta. This influx of refugees brings together the two major ancestral roots of traditional Navajo culture, the Athapascan and Puebloan. And what's really fascinating is how quickly these various separate peoples merged together in this crucible of resistance to the Spanish Empire, forming a single tribal identity in the space of a generation. And while active conflict was not always in the offing between Europeans and Navajo, from this point onward, from this fusion of peoples, the Navajo would not be subjugated. It's a truly remarkable example of autonomous change in the face of crisis and imperialism. This quote-unquote new tribe adopted not only from each other's ceremonialism, art, technology, and social organization, but also components of those same things from their oppressors. They adopted pastoralism of cattle and sheep, the use of wool, goats, cheese making, growing of peaches and cotton, horses, metalworking, even chimneys from the Europeans. So in contrast to some of the more isolationist traditions where we have this notion that resistance and autonomy and cultural dignity has to come from the only way to do that is through adherence to the old ways. The Navajo disproved that in a very powerful way, is that it's not about having to remain crystallized in the old ways. It's about having the right to choose what you select, what you adopt, and what you reject. It's about autonomy and the right of people to self-determination, right? And these people even combine the social structure of clan origins from both the Athapascans and Puebloans. Previously, people separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years of linguistic development came back together in this place and formed an incredibly powerful cultural identity. Well, the Navajo of the history books, right? By 1774, these processes of syncretism and recovery from the full-scale Spanish efforts at conquest, which had seriously faded by about 1715, had resulted in a people who were recognizably the Navajo we know today in language, custom, dress, and cosmology. It was at this point that they successfully drove the Spanish out of the eastern portion of their territory, making Santa Fe kind of the furthest north core settlement of the Spanish. There were outlying settlements around there, but Santa Fe was the largest settlement that the Spanish would be able to place in the north for a long, long time. And it was interesting that internal conflicts between the Puebloan and Athapascan traditions that had still been there following the Pueblo Revolt had been resolved in such a way that you can really see the emergence of a relatively well integrated pattern. And during this time period of the late 1700s, the Navajo successfully expanded their control of territory at the expense of both the Spanish and some of their First Nations neighbors. If you look at the Hopi attitudes towards the Navajo, you can get some idea of some of those people who lost some of the areas that they had previously claimed to this expansion of the Navajo, who were expanding demographically at a greater rate. There were more and more Navajo every year, whereas some of these other groups were not increasing in number or settlements at the same rate. And this is only partly due to reproductive additions. It continued to be something where new people were adopted into the Navajo Nation. So you didn't have to have, 10 generations of Navajo in your ancestry to be a Navajo, because it was a much more inclusive kind of system that could accommodate for people of backgrounds that were not Athabascan, that were not from a specific Pueblo, could all become Navajo. It was possible. It's a fascinating example of a very different approach to cultural identity. When Mexico became independent, September 16th, 1821, it resulted in a dynamic power shift in the region. New Mexicans were now better supplied with weapons than they had been during the period of Spanish colonialism because they were able to get guns from American gun traders. The Navajo now, despite the irony here, the Navajo now became a major target of slave traders. One particularly brutal campaign of slaving was started by Jose Antonio Vizcarra in 1823. And his slaving expedition into the Navajo territory set off an intensification of nearly constant violence that would not end until the 1860s, over a century, over almost 50 years of violence that was particularly brutal. The Navajo did gain a major victory in 1835 when they routed a large Mexican force in Washington Pass, killing not only the majority of the Mexican troops, but their commander as well. In 1837, the Pueblos rose in revolt, this time against the Mexican government, and this, unfortunately, for the Pueblos, failed again, but the Navajo support was there also, and with similar results. The new reprisals and flight from destroyed communities and fleeing from persecution by government troops, more Puebloan people entered into the Navajo communities at this time, another infusion. As the number, though, of enslaved Navajo increased, the tribe began to launch more and more attacks against the Spanish, trying to free their kinspeople, as well as, when that wasn't possible, to seek revenge on the captors and murderers of their family members and friends. And so it became genuinely a personal conflict and struggle. When the U.S. Army arrived in the Southwest during the Mexican-American War in 1846, it was another sea change in the situation. There were some American officers who would attempt to treat both sides fairly, but others espoused blatantly racist support for the New Mexican cause against the First Nations people. In either instance, both those that attempted to do it fairly as well as those who didn't even try, neither one of those had any appreciation for the complexities of the actual situation. By 1850, 3 treaties, none ever ratified by the U.S. Senate, had been signed between the U.S. and the Navajo tribe. but the private war between the tribe and the Anglo-Hispanic settlers continued. So the situation would change but not improve, and the Navajo resistance would continue. Here is a remarkable photograph of Manuelita, one of the greatest of all the Navajo war chiefs. If you're interested in looking up some of his personal history, I highly recommend it. Here you can see some of those things I was talking about with regard to the syncretism of the situation. These are three Navajo women sheep herders. This is a photograph from 1969 in Monument Valley. And given how incredible this time period in this situation is from an anthropological standpoint, I would highly recommend a couple of these volumes. This one is on the right, New Mexico and the Pimeria Alta, the colonial period in the American Southwest, edited by John Douglas and William Graves. And on the left is a book I'm reading myself right now, Situational Identities Along the Raiding Frontier of Colonial New Mexico, by Jun Sunseri, who's faculty at UC Berkeley. Both of these are excellent and recently published works on the matter. So if this is something you're interested in, please chase it down further. I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you've learned a little bit about Navajo history in this very brief overview. And thank you very much. Have a wonderful day.